Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight finally I get to The Brown Bomber. You know what? This album to me is rock and roll's ultimate road album. Now, what is a road album? Well, a road album to me is an album that is recorded, written while a band is either on tour or busy doing other band-related business. This is not the kind of album that a band goes and isolates itself like the Beatles did with Sgt. Pepper for months on end in the same studio, hammering and getting a perfect album in tune. But not so with Led Zeppelin's Brown Bomber, or as it's officially known as Led Zeppelin II. Now you gotta understand, Zeppelin had already put out their first album. They toured their asses off, folks, and in the midst of their third tour, they were notified that their first album had actually gone gold. It had reached number 10 on the charts, and that was really good for a brand new band that, as far as most fans knew, were nobodies. They didn't know these people. People in the industry, of course, knew about Jimmy Page. They even knew about John Paul Jones. But most of the fans paying for those tickets, buying that album, these guys were nobodies. And yet Led Zeppelin, the first album, sold so well that it actually reached number 10. Not bad, guys. Now, it was at the very festivities that the band received their gold records that Jimmy was getting pressure from the company to really get a second album out. They had just released their first album, and it had just gotten to number 10 by May of 1968. Of course, if they had had their way, he would have had that album out by summertime. He wouldn't get it out until October, but if you think about that, he gets notified in May that he has to have a new album out for this band, and he gets it released by October. That's amazing, folks. So it was right after those festivities that Jimmy Page ordered the band back into the studio. Now you have to understand, this band was exhausted at this point. John Paul Jones was taking things in stride. He was an old pro, just like Jimmy, and he knew what to expect. But the two rookie members, Bonzo and Robert Plant, they were exhausted, they missed their families, and the last thing they wanted to do was be in the studio at that time. So with all of that in mind, Jimmy knew he had to really drive this band. And so he made a decision to record where they could, when they could, and it didn't hurt that they had already done a couple of recording sessions while they were still in LA earlier. They had actually recorded at A&M Studios on their days off there while in LA. I mean, this band would wind up recording at Mystic Studios, Mirror Studios, A&R Studios, different from A&M Studios, Juggy Sound Studios, and Mayfair Studios in New York City, Morgan Studios in England, and even a very primitive 8-track hut of a studio, as Eddie Kramer put it, that didn't even have headphones for Robert to use to monitor his vocals while he recorded them. And somewhere in this madness, they even managed to go to Paris and lip sync their way through a video they thought they would use in America on American TV, a video they never used. Now you have to understand, the band had had no time off, so new material was going to have to come from things they could write on the road, as we've talked about before. This would include riffs and chord progressions that they would develop at sound checks during rehearsals for their tours, along with bits of paper with chordal changes and or lyrics written in their room when they could find a moment alone. This is where Robert Plant really came through as a lyricist. Here, Jimmy was quoted as saying, "I had always hoped he would." Now, we've covered that bit in the past, and certainly Robert Plant began to blossom at this time. And then there's Eddie Kramer, who now shows up and will continue to work with Led Zeppelin for a time period. This man said he begged, he borrowed, he stole studio time as the band did their tour, often recording Jimmy Page's solos in the hallways of studios. Now, he also said that working with Jimmy Page was a whole lot like working with Jimi Hendrix. He actually said that both Jimmy Page and Jimi Hendrix were both artists who were absolutely laser focused on what they wanted on tape. And in the end, this entire album was mixed in 2 days on what Eddie Kramer called the most primitive console he had ever worked on at Mayfair Studios. But him and Jimmy worked that console like it was a musical instrument. You can especially hear this on the magnificent first cut, Whole Lotta Love. You know, it was Jimmy who said that he really appreciated working with Eddie Kramer because of Eddie Kramer's knowledge on oscillating frequencies. This was absolutely imperative to create that stereo spectrum, that magnificent stereo spectrum on that particular cut. Now, with all of these things happening and all of these song idea fragments coalescing, sometimes not until they actually got into the studio, it was at this point that Jimmy said, hey, wait a minute, you know what? I think we're starting to sound a bit too different than what we did on our first album. It was only by talking to people as he made his way from studio to studio, track by track, that he realized, I am not going to make the same mistake that a lot of other bands do by presenting a safe sophomore album. It's forward or nowhere. With that, he said in an interview that many bands were playing it too safe. In that interview, he even said, I want each album to reach out further. That's the whole point. Now, you guys know what I think of Led Zeppelin's first album. Emotionally, that album is so very important to me. But this album was such a clear improvement and a major statement for this band compared to their first release. Their further explorations into the blues, rock-based progressions, as well as folk-based ideas, this band, along with Eddie Kramer joining the team and Jimmy able to squelch down any doubts that he had early on in that year, this album becomes, in my opinion, really the first heavy metal album of rock and roll. Now, I know a lot of critics say that it was Black Sabbath's Paranoid that was heavy metal's first so-called album, and I thoroughly disagree. I think heavy metal lands on this album, despite the fact that even Led Zeppelin themselves said many times they are not heavy metal. But you know, all of the key elements that would go on to develop and be clearly known as heavy metal are all here on this album. You know, this is almost rock's first 3D album to me. Everything comes to life. It's almost like, well, with the 60s, there was the Beatles, and what they did was magnificent. But this was music on steroids. And the fact that this band was just as brilliant as the Beatles were in their own way, we would see a brand new band on the horizon. A band that with this album, not only their first #1 selling album, but an album that knocked off Abbey Road as being the #1 album, outsold Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Waters, as well as the Stones' latest release. I mean, nobody saw this band coming. Surprise. Now, I'm not going to go over each and every individual track. I've already done that in previous videos, and I encourage you guys to take a look at my playlist page. There I have not only Led Zeppelin Decoded, but another playlist called All Led Zeppelin. I've covered this before. But here's my question to the tribe tonight. What do you guys think? Is this rock and roll's first heavy metal album? Could Led Zeppelin be seen as rock's first heavy metal band. If you agree with that, let me know why. And if you disagree, let me know why. I want to hear this, folks. By the way, if you enjoyed the video tonight, please give it a thumbs up. That helps the YouTube algo demon better recognize the channel and get it out there, and that helps with channel growth, and that's always good. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the channel as of yet, it is so easy. All you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button, then tap that top bell icon, and you'll be notified of all my future videos that cover some of the very best bands and artists from classic rock. All right, I'm ready to film my next video, but until I do, why not watch a couple of these? I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line. We are the tribe, and I'll see you in my next video.